Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Settle into where you are, take a slow breath, and let the day begin to fall away from your shoulders. There is no hurry tonight, and nothing here that asks anything of you. Tonight we step backward, almost 2,000 years, into a small shop on a quiet street in Rome. The street is the Vicus Sandalarius, just beyond the eastern edge of the Forum, where the booksellers and the sandal makers and the apothecaries kept their narrow doorways side by side beneath the long stone arcade. The light is the soft, slow, honey-colored light of an evening in the early autumn, and a single olive oil lamp has just been carried out onto the threshold. Above the door hangs a small painted board with the name of the shopkeeper and a curling vine of stylized herbs, and beside it, on a low stone shelf, 3 small clay jars wait, each one stoppered with a careful disc of wax. Let your eye travel slowly into the shop. The doorway is narrow, the floor is laid with small black and white mosaic tiles. The walls are a faded ochre. Along the back wall stands the long wooden counter, and behind it the deep stone shelves climb all the way to the high-beamed ceiling. On those shelves are the alabaster jars and the dark green glass flasks and the small linen bags and the round terracotta pots sealed with wax and cord. The air carries the slow mingled scents of beeswax, of dried thyme, of vinegar, of frankincense smoking quietly in a small bronze brazier set on the floor. From somewhere in the back room, where the small brick oven and the long stone bench of the workbench wait, comes the soft mineral smell of warm honey and warm wine. This is a tabernae medica, an apothecary's shop of the High Roman Empire. In the long century of the Antonines, perhaps in the 18th year of the reign of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius. It is the year 178, more or less. The great physician Galen of Pergamon, court doctor to the emperor, and the most learned medical writer the Mediterranean world has yet produced, is at this very moment writing one of his treatises in his quiet rooms only a few streets away, on the slope of the Quarenal Hill. The slow Roman dusk is falling, and the apothecary, a man of perhaps 50 winters, is preparing for the long evening's work. Tonight you are a quiet customer, or perhaps a young apprentice, sitting on the small wooden stool just inside the doorway. The apothecary nods to you without speaking, lights a second small lamp on the back counter, and begins, in his patient way, to bring down the jars from the shelves. He is going to walk you, very slowly, through the long catalogue of the recipes that this small shop knows by heart. Not as instructions, you understand, but as stories. Each jar, each linen bag, each small alabaster pot has its own quiet history, its own line of teachers and apprentices, reaching back through the long centuries, its own connection to a name or a place or a moment that has come down to us through the slow patience of the written word. That is the pace I would like to keep tonight. Slow, patient, steady as the breath of a man at long honest work, quiet as the dust settling on the high beam, where the dried garlands of last summer still hang. We will turn now to the world that surrounds this small shop before we go to the recipes themselves. Some understanding of that world will help, for the recipes only fully open to a listener who knows a little of the soil they grew in. Imagine for a moment, then, that you let your eye drift out of the shop and along the quiet street and across the city, and a little way out of the city as well. Roman medicine, in this late 2nd century of the empire, was a slow inheritance from many older worlds. From Greece, above all, came the long tradition of Hippocrates, the physician of the small island of Kos, who had written 6 centuries earlier that disease was not the work of angry gods, but the natural unbalance of natural things, and that the careful physician must observe and measure and patiently encourage the body to find its own way back into balance. From Hippocrates came the long doctrine of the 4 humours, which lay at the very root of every prescription in the apothecary's shop. The body, it was said, was made of blood, of phlegm, of yellow bile, and of black bile. A man whose blood ran high was sanguine, full of warmth and quick laughter. A man whose phlegm ran high was phlegmatic, steady and slow. A man whose yellow bile ran high was choleric, given to anger and to bright, restless energy. A man whose black bile ran high was melancholic, given to long thought and to slow sadness. Every season had its humor, every food had its humor, every herb had its humor, and the apothecary's quiet art was the patient balancing of one humor against another. A cold, dry herb to settle a warm, wet trouble, a warm, wet herb to ease a cold, dry trouble. The whole long tradition, 6 centuries old already, lay quietly behind every jar on the shelf. From Egypt came the older art of the temple unguents. The patient Egyptian tradition of perfumed oils and resin-rich salves, brought into Rome with the corn, fleets of Alexandria, with the Cleopatra, trade of the late Republic, with the steady traffic of the Eastern Mediterranean. From the Egyptian temples came the quiet use of frankincense and myrrh, of styrax and benzoin, of the slow blending of resin and oil that would, in time, give Rome its great traditions of unguentaria, the small, narrow, necked glass flasks of perfumed oil that filled the dressing tables of every well-kept Roman matron. From the Persian Empire and the long caravan routes of the further east came the spice trade, the careful import of ginger and pepper, of cinnamon and cardamom, of dried saffron and gum arabic and lapis lazuli ground for cosmetics. The great long ships of the Roman Red Sea trade sailed in their slow regular monsoon, rhythm to and from Muziris on the Malabar coast of India. And the small dried buds and seeds and barks of Asia found their way, by old journey, onto the high shelves of the apothecaries of the imperial capital. By the time of our shop, in the late 2nd century, a single Roman household of moderate means might consume in a year a small handful of Indian pepper that would have traveled, in its quiet way, through 6 or 7 different hands across 2,500 miles of land and sea. From the temples of Asclepius came another whole strand of healing entirely. The temples of the gentle healer, God with his serpent, twined staff, and his quiet daughters, Hygeia and Panacea, stood in many cities of the empire, and the Great Mother Temple stood on the small island in the middle of the Tiber, just downstream from the bridge of Fabricius. Sick people came there from across the empire, were given a clean bed in the long porticos, were fed simple food, were offered slow ritual baths, and were told to sleep. In the sleep, they dreamt of the god, and in the dream, the god told them what to do. In the morning, the priests, who knew the recipes of 1,000 previous dreams, would prescribe the suitable herb. The temples were not in opposition to the apothecaries. They sent each other their custom. A patient who came to the apothecary's shop with a serious trouble might be sent down to the island for a night of dream, incubation, and a patient discharged from the temple with a careful written list of herbs would carry that list straight to a shop like ours From the patient working life of the empire itself came the everyday medicine of the Roman household, the quiet tradition of the country wives and the kitchen cooks and the legionary surgeons. Every Roman household kept a small lararium of gentle pots, the salt and the honey and the vinegar and the dried herbs of the year, and used them slowly, patiently, as the seasons turned. A grandmother in a hill village outside Tibur, sitting at her hearth with a small pot of wine and a sprig of thyme, was practicing a medicine perhaps 1,000 years older than the books of Hippocrates, and her quiet remedies, passed down by mouth from mother to daughter, supplied the city apothecaries in many quiet ways with the steady backbone of their craft. Around all of this lay the careful written tradition of the medical authors. The greatest, by far, was Pedanius Dioscorides, an army surgeon of the time of Nero, who traveled with the legions across half the empire, who saw the herbs of Spain and Gaul and Asia Minor, and Egypt and Cilicia at first hand, and who wrote, around the year 65, his great work De Materia Medica, the 5 quiet books of medical material, in which 600 and more herbs and minerals were listed, each one with its appearance, its preparation, its uses, its dosing. The book was copied and copied for the next 16 centuries. It was the steady backbone of every apothecary cupboard in the Mediterranean and beyond. A Roman apothecary of our shop asked the question of how to identify a particular herb, would reach for his careful copy of Dioscorides without a second thought. Beside Dioscorides stood Aulus Cornelius Celsus, the patient and graceful encyclopedist of the early 1st century, who wrote in clear, simple Latin a long treatise on the whole of medicine, the De Medicina, with its steady chapters on diet, on surgery, on bleeding, on bandaging. Celsus was not a practicing physician at all, but a quiet country gentleman, a man of leisure, and his book has the quiet elegance of one who has studied widely and written carefully without the hurry of the busy practitioner. Many of the careful Latin terms still in use in modern medicine. The cancer and the malum and the febris were first set down in their modern senses by his patient hand. Beside Celsus stood Scribonius Largus, the court physician of the Emperor Claudius, whose compositions is a careful catalogue of almost 300 recipes, copied directly from the practice of the imperial pharmacy. Scribonius was a Greek freedman of patient temperament, and his book opens with a quiet meditation on the humanity of the physician, on the duty of care that the physician owes to even the most troublesome patient, on the steady patience that medicine asks of those who practice it. Towering over them all, in the patient late 2nd century of our shop, stood Galen himself, the patient, methodical, deeply learned, unfailingly verbose physician of Pergamon, who wrote so many books that no one has ever counted them all, who took the doctrine of the 4 humours and shaped it into a system so complete that it would govern European medicine for 1,500 years, and whose careful prescriptions for compound remedies would be copied, line by line, by every apothecary worth the name from Damascus to Toledo. Galen was a man of strong opinions and of long sentences, and his books, by their sheer mass, came in time to be the great quiet weight on every apothecary's shelf. There was, in the older tradition, the patient memory of Crachuas, the great herbalist of the 1st century before Christ, who served Mithridates VI of Pontus, and who is reputed to have been the first man to draw careful color. Illustrations of the herbs, the that the country physician might recognize them without the hand of a master at his elbow. There was the patient memory of Theophrastus, the quiet pupil of Aristotle, who in the 4th century before Christ had written his great history of plants. There was the patient memory of Pliny the Elder, who in the late 1st century had compiled his enormous natural history, with its long, slightly credulous, eternally readable catalogue of every strange folk, remedy in the Roman world, and who had died in the year 79 by the slow ash fall of Vesuvius, while standing too near a volcano he had wished to study. The Roman medical tradition was a long, slow, patient inheritance of careful writers, each one adding a quiet layer to the slow accumulation of the cupboard. These were the great names. Beneath them stood the practical men, the medicus, who held the small bronze and iron tools, who set the bones and stitched the wounds, and lanced the boils, and listened to the slow chests of the sick. The pharmacopola, who travelled the country roads with a small mule and a wide wooden tray of mixed remedies for the country folk. The herbarius, who walked the dry hillsides at dawn and dusk through the seasons, gathering the careful herbs of the trade. The unguentarius, who sat in a quiet city shop and blended the quiet perfumed oils of the wealthy, slowly, patiently, with the small bronze stirrer in the long, necked alabaster pot. The apothecarius, the man at our counter tonight, who held in his patient head the longest list of all, the recipes of the tradition, 2,000 and more, carried in the quiet head from teacher to apprentice through long quiet decades of patient work. There was also, in the imperial capital, the Supplasiarius, named for the Supplasia, the small square in the center of the Campanian town of Capua, where the great perfumers had once gathered, and where a particular kind of fine, grade ointment was traditionally compounded. The Supplasiarius supplied the high end of the trade, the gentle pots of the senatorial households, the very slow regale unguentum of the imperial court. There was the medicamentarius, who specialized in the careful storage of the dried herbs through the long winter, who knew the precise way to keep saffron from losing its color, the precise way to keep rose petals from losing their scent, the precise way to keep frankincense from losing its quiet weight in the bronze scale pan. Around the great names and the practical men lay the quiet women of the Roman medical world, who appear in the written record only in fragments, but who carried, by every honest indication, a great share of the day-to-day work, the midwives who attended every birth in the empire and who passed down the careful remedies of women's medicine through long quiet generations, the wet nurses who knew the small herbs of the colicky baby and the teething child, the matrons of the great country estates who kept their small still rooms and their steady written notebooks, and who supplied the apothecaries of the nearby towns with the gentle herbs of their own garden harvests. The slave women of the great urban households who blended the daily face creams and bath oils for their mistresses, and who, in many cases, knew the secret of a particular preparation more thoroughly than any physician in the city. The whole long quiet web of the Roman medical world settled, in the careful late 2nd century, around the small shops of the apothecaries on the streets of the imperial capital. Our shop, on the Vicus Sandalarius, was one of perhaps 300 or 400 such shops in Rome, each one with its own slow particular character, each one with its own long shelf of jars, each one with its own quiet apothecary, who held the slow tradition in his patient head. So the man at the counter takes down the first jar from the long shelf, and very gently, and with the slow patience of one who is in no hurry at all, he begins. Let us turn, then, to the first recipe of the night. The first recipe is theriac. Theriac is the great compound remedy of the Roman world. It is the most famous, the most copied, the most quietly revered of all the careful preparations of the apothecary cupboard, and the one that, more than any other, made the careers of physicians and the fortunes of apothecaries for 1500 years. The Greek name theriac comes from therion, a wild beast or a venomous serpent, for the original purpose of the recipe was to cure the bite of any poisonous creature. It was the great snake bite remedy of antiquity. Over time, slowly and patiently, as the recipe was added to and refined and extended by physician after physician, it came to be reckoned a remedy not only for the bite of the asp and the viper, but for almost every long lingering illness in the catalogue, for the slow plagues of the city, for the sudden poisons of the table, for the long wasting fevers, for the heaviness of the heart, and even, at last, for the small slow troubles of the elderly that had no other name. The earliest form of theriac is older even than Rome. It traces back to the great Greek physician Andromachus the Elder, court doctor to the Emperor Nero, who refined a still earlier preparation that had been used in the cities of Asia Minor for at least a century before him. Andromachus is said to have written a steady poem in elegiac Greek verse, setting out the ingredients that the patient physician might learn the recipe by heart and never lose a single line of it. The poem of Andromachus survived, by quiet luck, into the Byzantine centuries, and the careful 64 ingredients of theriac were memorized by the slow apothecaries of Constantinople into the late Middle Ages, by which time the original Greek had been translated into Latin, into Arabic, into Persian, and into the small careful languages of the Italian city-states. The recipe for theriac in the quiet Galenic form contained 64 ingredients. Some authors, who liked a round number, called it 60. Some lists in the late Byzantine tradition climbed to 70 and even 73. The careful Galenic recipe of the 2nd century, copied directly into the writings of the great physician, settles on 64. We will take it tonight at 64, in the patient way that the apothecary at the counter would have spoken of it to a young apprentice on a slow autumn evening, such as this one. The most famous ingredient, and the most particular, was the flesh of the viper. The careful Roman apothecary kept a small basket of dried viper, flesh prepared in the high spring of each year. The vipers were caught, by tradition, in the dry stony hills above Tibur by a small group of professional viper catchers who passed the trade down through their families for many generations. They were brought to the shop in small earthenware pots, alive and angry. The steady preparation of the viper, flesh undertaken once a year in the warm weeks of late April, was the great spring labor of every apothecary's shop, and the smell of slow boiling viper flesh hung in the back rooms of the apothecaries of the Vicus Sandalarius in those few weeks, like a quiet annual perfume that no one but the apothecaries themselves recognized. Beside the viper flesh, the recipe called for opium, the dried gum of the poppy of the eastern Mediterranean. The opium was kept in a small sealed jar on the highest shelf, behind a gentle iron grate, and was parted with very sparingly. The Roman apothecary in the year 178, paid as much for a small ounce of high-grade Theban opium as for a small ounce of the finest Indian saffron, and he kept the careful weights of his transactions in a patient ledger. The recipe called for cinnamon, the dried inner bark of the small evergreen tree of southern India, and Ceylon, which had travelled by the gentle Red Sea trade from the warm slopes of the Western Ghats to the high shelves of the Roman shop. It called for myrrh, the dried gum of the small thorny tree of Arabia Felix, the same myrrh that the Magi were said, in the careful Christian tradition that was just beginning to take root in the empire, to have brought to a particular newborn child 170 years before. It called for frankincense, of the same Arabian provenance, the slow white tear of the small tree of the Hadramawt, gathered by patient men with small bronze knives during the quiet weeks of the southern summer. It called for cassia, the cousin of cinnamon, which had its own long trade, wrote from the river mouths of the Mekong Delta to the warehouses of Alexandria. It called for spikenard, the slow musky perfume of the small mountain plant of the high Himalayas, sold in tiny stoppered alabaster flasks at unimaginable prices, and used in theriac in only the smallest steady pinch. It called for saffron, the slender red threads of the autumn, flowering crocus, gathered by hand in the dry uplands of southern Asia Minor. It called for the small dried roots of long pepper, the bright sweet warm cousin of black pepper that travelled westward from the Coromandel coast. It called for the small dried leaves of marjoram, of mint, of rue, of sage, of thyme, of horehound, of southernwood. It called for the dried roots of valerian, of iris, of gentian, of bitter wormwood. It called for the dried seeds of fennel, of anise, of cumin, of coriander, of carrot, of celery. It called for the small careful pinches of pure earth minerals, of red bole and of yellow ochre. It called for the small careful drops of vinegar of old wine, slowly aged in the dark cellars of the Sabine hills. It called for gentle honey, the quiet binder of all the long catalogue of long ingredients. The full 64 ingredients were ground, separately, through the long day of compounding, in the great heavy bronze mortar of the apothecary, by the patient apprentice of the shop. Each ingredient was weighed in a small bronze scale pan and laid out in small linen heaps along the stone bench. The small heaps were inspected by the patient eye of the senior apothecary, tested between his fingers, sniffed by his nose. Only when each ingredient passed his inspection was it added, in turn, to the great compounding bowl. The compounding bowl was a wide, shallow stone basin, perhaps 3 handspans across, scrubbed clean each morning with hot water and dried mint, lined with a clean linen cloth, and set on the stone bench at the heart of the shop. Into the compounding bowl, in the patient turn of the day, the apothecary added the heaps of the ground ingredients. The cinnamon was added first, then the myrrh, then the frankincense, then the cassia, then the spikenard, then the saffron, then the long pepper. The dried leaves were added in their turn. The dried roots were added in their turn. The dried seeds were added in their turn. The earth, minerals and the wine, vinegar and the warm honey were added at the last. The whole was stirred slowly by the patient apothecary with a long bronze stirrer, in slow turns through the afternoon. The stirring was undertaken in a particular order, with a particular rhythm that the Galenic tradition reckoned to be the patient unfolding of the sympathies of the herbs. The apothecary at the long bench would sometimes hum, very quietly, the elegiac verses of Andromachus, that his slow stirring might keep time with the long inheritance of the trade. When the long stirring was done, the dark electuary, now a thick sticky paste of the color of black honey, was scraped into a small alabaster jar, sealed with a careful disc of wax, and set onto a high shelf in the back room. There it would stay, untouched, for a period of years, sometimes 10 years, sometimes 15, sometimes as much as 20. The patient tradition reckoned that theriac, like a wine of the southern hills, only came into its full strength with the patience of the years. A jar of theriac at 10 years old was reckoned to be at the beginning of its strength. At 15 years it was at its prime. At 20 years it had reached the peak of the long tradition. At 30 years it was a curiosity, taken down from the shelf only once a year for the inspection of the master apothecary, and tasted in the smallest spoonful, with a quiet turn of the head, to see whether the years had been kind to it, or had at last begun to take its strength away. Theriac was sold, by the spoonful, to the patient customers of the long shop. The Roman matron, troubled by a fever that had not settled, would come to the counter with a small glass flask, and would pay perhaps half a denarius for a spoonful of the dark electuary, scraped from the alabaster jar by the patient apothecary, sealed into the small flask with a disc of wax, and carried home in the warm hand of the matron through the slow lamplit street. The customers of the highest grade were the Roman emperors themselves. Marcus Aurelius, who reigned over Rome in the late 2nd century, was a daily taker of theriac, having been put onto the small morning spoonful by his court physician Galen of Pergamon. The emperor took his daily portion in a cup of warm water, sweetened with a little honey, in the early morning hour, before the long affairs of the imperial day. His personal theriac was prepared by the palace pharmacy from a jar that, by the imperial tradition, was never less than 15 years old and never more than 25. The theriac of the Roman world passed, by long inheritance, into the Byzantine apothecaries, into the Arabic apothecaries, into the Italian apothecaries of the Middle Ages, into the early modern apothecaries of Venice and Bologna and Padua, where it was prepared by old ceremonial tradition, in a great annual public compounding undertaken in the main square of the city, that the citizens might watch the ingredients being weighed and ground and added to the bowl, and might be assured of the quality of the electuary that would, in the course of the year, be sold from the apothecaries of the town. In Venice, the theriaca veneziana was reckoned, into the late 18th century, to be the finest in the world, and was exported, in small flasks, as far afield as London and Paris, as St. Petersburg and Constantinople and Cairo. There is, in the long tradition of theriac, an inheritance that reaches from the court of Mithridates VI of Pontus, in the late 2nd century before Christ, through the court of Nero, through the court of Marcus Aurelius, through the Byzantine palaces, through the Arab caliphates, through the Venetian apothecaries, all the way into the pharmacies of the early 19th century. Almost 2,000 years. In every one of those quiet centuries, the electuary of 64 ingredients sat in its small alabaster jar on the high shelf, aging slowly, ready to be parted with by the spoonful to a patient customer with a trouble of the body that nothing else in the cupboard had been able to ease. It is a long story, and we have spent the first hour of the night upon it. But theriac is the great recipe of the apothecary, and it is the proper place to begin. Let us turn now to the second recipe of the night. The second recipe is mithridatium. Mithridatium is the close cousin of theriac, the older brother in fact, the careful preparation from which theriac itself, in its full Galenic form, was descended. The story behind mithridatium is one of the strangest and most remarkable of all the stories of the apothecary's cupboard, and it is a story that the patient apothecary at the counter would tell on a quiet autumn evening such as this one, with a small thoughtful smile, for it is one that he himself loved. The story begins in the late 2nd century before the Christian era, with a small boy in a hill fortress in the kingdom of Pontus on the southern shore of the Black Sea. The boy was Mithridates, the 6th of his name, the son of the king of Pontus, born in the year 135 before Christ in the small white walled fortress of Sinope. His mother was a Seleucid princess of Persian and Macedonian descent. His father was the king. The boy was raised by all accounts in the quiet courtyards of the fortress with a quiet Greek tutor, and grew into a tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed young man with a remarkable memory for languages. When Mithridates was 11 years old, his father was poisoned at a banquet, by men, it was said, in the long pay of the queen, who herself stood next in line for the throne. The queen, in the manner of regents through long history, then took up the regency in the name of the young heir, and began the patient work of arranging for him, too, to be removed from the line of succession. She tried, by the quiet account of the ancient writers, to poison the boy on at least 4 separate occasions through his early adolescence. Each time, by the watchful care of his Greek tutor, the poisoned dish was either intercepted or fed first to a dog. The boy, growing slowly into the awareness of what was happening to him, began to think very carefully about poisons. By the time he was 15, Mithridates had fled the court of his mother and was living, in disguise, in the deep forests of the Pontic interior, hunting bear and boar with a small band of companions, eating only what he himself had killed and prepared, drinking only from running streams that he had himself approached. He spent 7 years in the forest. In that long, quiet exile, he developed a lifelong fascination with poisons and their antidotes, and began, on himself, the careful experiments that would, in time, give the world the recipe of the mithridatium. The patient idea, in the careful young head of the future king, was that a man who took, every day, a very small dose of a particular poison, and slowly increased the dose, day by day, over many years, might in time train his body to bear, without harm, a quantity of that poison that would kill any other man at the table. The idea, in modern medical language, is the doctrine of acquired tolerance. The young Mithridates had no such language, but he had the patient observation of his own body, the gentle written notes of his Greek tutor, and the patient willingness, over the course of decades, to test the idea on himself. He began with the small, simple poisons, the dried bitter root of the white hellebore, the dried small berries of the deadly nightshade, the dried bitter leaves of the autumn meadow saffron, the dried small white grains of arsenic ore. He took, every morning, before any food, the smallest careful pinch of one of these poisons, dissolved in a small cup of warm wine sweetened with honey. He kept careful notes. He recorded the day, the hour, the quantity, the color and texture of the wine, the small sensations in his body in the hours that followed. Over months, then years, he slowly increased the morning dose. The body, by patient inheritance, learned. By his late 20s, when he had at last returned to claim his throne, he was able to take, in the morning cup, a quantity of poison that would kill any other man at the breakfast table within the hour. The patient work over time broadened. Mithridates added to his morning cup the dried bitter leaves of belladonna, the dried small umbels of hemlock, the dried small flowers of monkshood, the dried small white seeds of opium, the dried small black seeds of the strychnose tree of the Indian forests, the dried small flesh of certain venomous snakes of the Pontic mountains. He kept, at his court at Sinope, a small steady menagerie of poisonous serpents, of poisonous spiders, of poisonous scorpions, the venom of which was, in the most careful, tiny quantities, blended into his daily morning cup. He kept also a small careful library of medical books gathered from across the ancient world, and he employed, at his court, a remarkable Greek herbalist named Cratiwas, who is reputed, as we mentioned earlier, to have been the first man in the Western tradition to draw patient color, illustrations of medicinal plants. The patient experiments, over the course of 40 long years, produced, by careful refinement, the recipe that we know today as mithridatium. It contained, in the careful original form, 54 ingredients. The exact list, in the quiet written form of Cratiwas, is lost, but a closely related list, attributed to Damocrates, the careful Roman physician of the early 1st century after Christ, has come down to us, and a third related list, attributed to Andromachus the Younger, son of the Andromachus we met earlier, has come down to us as well. The three lists overlap considerably, and the modern reader of the careful medical histories can, by patient comparison, reconstruct the broad outlines of the original. The mithridatium, like its descendant theriac, was an electuary, a thick, dark, sticky paste of many ingredients bound together with honey. It was kept in a small alabaster jar on the high shelf, behind the gentle iron grate. It was parted with very sparingly, by the spoonful, in a cup of warm wine sweetened with honey, in the early morning hour before food. It was reckoned, by the long Roman tradition, to be a remedy not only against poisons of every kind, but also against the slow troubles of the heart, against the heaviness of the elderly, against the long restless nights of the worried, against the slow plagues of the autumn, against the patient bites of any venomous creature. The careful end of Mithridates himself is one of the great quiet ironies of the ancient world. He fought for 50 years against the slow rising power of Rome. He fought 3 long wars with the Romans, each one larger than the one before. He held, at one moment in his late middle years, almost the whole of Asia Minor, much of Greece, and the southern shore of the Black Sea. In the year 66 before Christ, after a final desperate campaign, he was at last defeated by the Roman general Pompey the Great in a great battle on the slopes of the Lycus River. He fled with a small band of companions to the careful north shore of the Black Sea, to the small Crimean fortress of Panticapaeum, where his son Pharnaces had set himself up as a quiet local king. In the year 63 before Christ, finding himself betrayed by his son, who had gone over to the Romans, the old King Mithridates, then aged 72, decided, by the steady weighing of all his careful options, to take his own life. He gathered his daughters and his closest companions, and offered each of them a small, careful cup of poison. The daughters and the companions drank, and quietly died, one after another, in the small white, walled chamber of the fortress. The old king then drank his own cup, and waited, by the patient account of the ancient writers, for the old poison to work upon him. It would not work. By the patient inheritance of 40 long years of slow morning experiments, the body of Mithridates had been so carefully accustomed to almost every poison in the careful catalogue that the cup had, on him, almost no effect at all. He sat in the small chamber, by the careful Greek account of the writer Appian, for a long hour, drank a second cup, drank a third cup, and was still alive. In the end, by the quiet Greek account, he asked one of his Gallic bodyguards, a man named Bituitus, to draw his sword and end the matter quickly. Bituitus did so. The old king Mithridates, the great enemy of Rome, the patient student of poisons, the inventor of the antidote that would carry his name for 2,000 years, died at last by the careful sword of his own loyal bodyguard in the small white, walled chamber of the small Crimean fortress. Pompey the Great, the Roman general who had defeated him, took the careful library of the dead king, with all its gentle medical books and all its patient written notes, back to Rome. The notes were translated by the patient slaves of Pompey's household from the original Greek into Latin. They were read carefully by the Roman physicians of the late 1st century before Christ. They were copied and re-copied. The recipe of mithridatium passed, by the patient inheritance, into the steady medical practice of Augustus, of Tiberius, of Claudius, of Nero, and at last into the gentle hands of the great Galen of Pergamon, who refined it in his long way into the 64-ingredient theriac that we have already met. The mithridatium and the theriac sat, side by side, on the high shelf of every apothecary's cupboard from the late 1st century before Christ down to the careful pharmacies of the early 19th century. Almost 2,000 years. There is, in the long story of mithridatium, a patient inheritance that runs from the small forest exile of a frightened young prince in the kingdom of Pontus, through the patient writings of the Greek herbalist Critias, through the patient Roman libraries of Pompey, through the quiet court physicians of the Julio Claudian emperors, through the careful copying hands of the Byzantine apothecaries, through the gentle learned apothecaries of medieval Italy, into the gentle working pharmacies of the modern world. It is a story of slow patient observation, of patient experiment, of slow patient inheritance, of long patient refinement. It is a story of one boy in one forest, who, over 40 quiet years, taught his own body to bear almost any poison that the world might offer it. It is one of the strangest stories in the old history of medicine. The patient apothecary at the counter, who has finished telling the story, turns now to the next jar on the shelf. He moves slowly. He is in no hurry at all. Let us turn now to the third recipe of the night. The third recipe is the great white salve of Galen. We turn now to the quiet shelf of the wound salves, the patient catalogue of the unguents, and the poultices and the careful preparations of the apothecary that were used, by the slow turn of the centuries, for the steady tending of wounds. The Roman world was a world of wounds. The legions on the long frontiers of the empire returned from each season's campaign with their slow bandages and their steady cuts and their gentle fractures. The arena, in the patient great cities of the empire, sent its long lines of wounded gladiators, to the small surgeries of the careful arena doctors, the patient daily life of the working empire, with its gentle stone cutters and its careful blacksmiths and its quiet slaves at the patient looms, produced its long daily catalogue of small cuts and burns and bruises and abrasions. The wound salve was, after the long, standing electuaries of theriac and mithridatium, the next great pillar of the apothecary's cupboard. The first of the wound salves was the careful white salve of Galen, the Cerussa Ceratum, the most famous of all. It was prepared from 4 ingredients. The first was clean white beeswax, gathered in the warm summer from the gentle hives of the country bee. Keepers melted slowly in a clean bronze pot. The second was clean olive oil of the first pressing, brought in small clean amphorae from the careful slopes of southern Italy. The third was clean pale white lead, the Cerussa, prepared by a patient process of vinegar, vapor acting upon thin sheets of metallic lead, in a sealed clay pot, scraped off as a fine pale white powder. The fourth was a small pinch of clean rose water, distilled by the unguentarius from the careful Damascene roses of the small palace gardens. The 4 ingredients were blended together, slowly, over a small charcoal fire, in a clean bronze pot, by the patient apothecary, who stirred the mixture, slowly, with a long bronze stirrer, until it had blended into a soft pale yellow cream. The steady preparation was then scraped, hot, into a small alabaster pot and sealed, when it had cooled, with a careful disc of wax. It was kept on the middle shelf of the apothecary's cupboard, in a small painted line of identical alabaster pots, and was sold, by the small pot at a time, to the customers of the long shop. The careful white salve was used for the small everyday wound, the cut of the cook, in the patient kitchen of a noble house that bled into the patient's stew. The blistered foot of the legionary on the long march that asked for the careful tending of the quiet evening hour. The grazed knee of the gentle slave, boy who had fallen on the careful stone steps of the gentle patrician house. The raw scraped skin of the long woman who had reached her careful hand across the steady wrong stove. The patient apothecary at the counter would look at the wound, would clean it carefully with a small clean cloth, would spread a pinch of the white salve upon it, and would bind the careful place with a small clean linen bandage. There is, of course, a long shadow over the patient white salve of Galen, the pale white lead, the Cerussa, that was the careful third ingredient, was, by every modern account, a slow poison. The patient white salve, applied to a patient open wound day after day, slowly carried the quiet white lead into the careful body of the patient, where it slowly accumulated in the old bones and in the quiet brain and in the small kidneys, by way of a patient chronic lead, poisoning that, in the long course of years, sometimes took the patient gently from the world before his time. The gentle Roman apothecary did not, of course, know this. The careful late 20th century did. We will not labor the point. We will let the small shadow rest in the back room. Let us turn now to the second of the wound salves of the night. The second of the wound salves was the careful honey poultice of the legionary surgeon. It was by far the simpler of the two. It was, in fact, almost the simplest preparation in the entire apothecary's cupboard, and yet it was, by the quiet testimony of the centuries, the most reliably effective. It consisted of one ingredient, honey. The steady Roman army surgeon kept, in his careful kit, a small clay pot of clean honey, gathered fresh from the patient country bee. keepers of the regions through which the legion passed. When a soldier came to the patient surgeon's tent with an open wound, the surgeon would clean the careful wound with clean wine, would scrape away any dirt or debris with a small clean bronze pick, would inspect the gentle place under the quiet lamp, and would then, very carefully, spoon a thick layer of the clean honey directly onto the careful wound. The wound was then bound with a small clean linen bandage and was left in the long tradition for 2 or 3 days before being unwrapped and inspected. The slow observation of the gentle army surgeons across many centuries was that wounds tended in this way healed unusually well. They closed cleanly. They did not, in the long majority of cases, develop the small angry redness and the steady suppuration that would, in those days, take so many soldiers from the world by way of quiet blood poisoning. The careful Roman army surgeons did not, of course, understand why the patient honey worked. The steady late 20th century again did. The clean honey, by its careful chemical composition, draws moisture out of the gentle tissue around the wound, creating a patient environment in which most bacteria cannot, in fact, live. The careful natural enzymes of the honey, in addition, slowly produce a small long quantity of hydrogen peroxide, which is, by every account, a gentle antiseptic. The careful Roman surgeons, by patient observation alone, had stumbled, by the slow inheritance of the centuries, onto one of the great quiet kindnesses of the natural world. The gentle honey poultice was used not only on the careful wounds of the legionaries. It was also the patient first reach of the apothecary at the counter for any small open wound of any patient customer. The cut of the steady kitchen knife, the small angry boil that had at last opened, the slow ulcer of the careful elderly leg, the gentle raw place at the corner of the patient baby's mouth. The patient apothecary, who had been taught the long preparation by his quiet own teacher, who had been taught it by his teacher in turn, would reach slowly for the small clay pot of clean honey on the middle shelf, and would treat the careful place, and would send the patient home with a small linen bandage and a patient instruction to come back in 3 days for the patient unwrapping. Let us turn now to the third of the wound salves of the night. The third of the wound salves was the steady green salve of the apothecary, the unguentum veride, used for the older, slower, more stubborn wounds, for the gentle ulcers of the careful elderly leg, for the steady infections that the careful honey poultice had not, in the patient course of a week or 2, fully resolved. The careful green salve was the patient deeper, reaching helper of the careful cupboard. The recipe was a quiet blend of clean white beeswax, of clean olive oil, of crushed dried verdigris, and of a careful pinch of crushed dried frankincense. The careful crushed dried verdigris was the gentle pale green powder produced by the patient action of vinegar, vapor upon thin sheets of metallic copper, scraped off as a fine pale green dust, and stored in a small careful clay pot on the middle shelf. The 4 ingredients were blended together slowly over a small charcoal fire in a clean bronze pot by the patient apothecary until they had blended into a soft pale green cream. The careful preparation was then scraped, hot, into a small alabaster pot and sealed, when cool, with a steady disc of wax. The careful green salve was applied to the long stubborn wound of the patient elderly customer, very sparingly, with the patient tip of a small bronze spatula, and was bound again with a clean linen bandage. The gentle copper of the verdigris had, by the patient observation of the apothecaries, a quiet drying, careful astringent, long gently antiseptic effect upon the old wound. The gentle frankincense had, by the quiet observation of the apothecaries, a gentle pain-easing, gently anti-inflammatory effect upon the slow wound. The two steady ingredients together, in the patient hand of the apothecary, brought back, in time, many a steady stubborn wound that the patient honey poultice alone had not been able to resolve. There is, in the gentle tradition of the wound salves of the apothecary, a quiet inheritance that runs from the patient Egyptian temple physicians of the late 2nd millennium before Christ, through the careful Greek physicians of the patient classical age, through the quiet Roman army surgeons of the empire, through the careful Byzantine military medical service, through the gentle Arab physicians of the medieval caliphates, through the gentle Italian surgeons of the late Middle Ages, into the careful working pharmacies of the modern world. The clean honey of the steady country bee keeper, applied to the careful open wound of the patient, has been, for almost 4,000 years, one of the steady kindnesses of the patient medical tradition. The careful green salve and the patient white salve, in their steady turn, have been refined, replaced, refined again. But the clean honey, in its small clay pot on the gentle middle shelf, has remained the patient reach of the careful country physician for almost as long as any preparation in the old catalogue of the apothecary's cupboard. The patient apothecary at the long counter, who has now finished with the wound salves, turns slowly to the next jar on the shelf. The night is still long. The lamp burns steadily. The frankincense in the small bronze brazier on the floor sends up its slow thin curl of pale grey smoke. There is no hurry at all. Let us turn now to the fourth recipe of the night. The fourth recipe is the careful tradition of the sleep tonics of the apothecary. We turn now to a softer shelf, one that the patient apothecary at the counter will reach for with a small, private smile, for it is a shelf that he himself, in the steady evenings of his older years, has come to know well. It is the shelf of the sleep tonics. The gentle preparations of the cupboard, for the quiet restless nights of the careful elderly, for the careful wary heads of the long grieving, for the patient turning thoughts of those whose minds will not let them go softly into the dark. The Romans of the late 2nd century lived, as people in every century have lived, in a world of long restless nights. The careful Roman city, with its narrow streets and its small clay lamps and its small patient sounds of dogs and watchmen and distant carts, was not, by every quiet account, a quiet place to sleep. The careful Roman writer Juvenal, in his famous third satire, complained at length of the slow sleeplessness of the gentle Roman night, of the steady carts that rolled all night through the gentle narrow streets, of the gentle shouts of drunken revellers returning from the taverns, of the long barking of the dogs in the patient courtyards. The careful Roman, who could afford it, paid extra for a quiet courtyard apartment in the long upper levels of the steady insulae, where the old noises of the street did not so easily reach him. The careful Roman, who could not, slept lightly and woke often, and reached by tradition for the small alabaster pot of the apothecary's sleep tonic on the patient bedside table. The first of the sleep tonics was the careful preparation of opium in wine. The opium of the Eastern Mediterranean has been used, by careful tradition, for the easing of pain and the gentle bringing of sleep, since at least the late Bronze Age. The quiet Cretan poppy, goddesses of the late 2nd millennium before Christ, with their small clay heads ringed with seed, capsules and their small clay smiles, are reckoned by the patient modern archaeologists to be among the careful earliest evidence of the patient relationship between human beings and the gentle opium poppy. The gentle Greeks called the dried gum of the poppy Myconian, and the careful Romans called it papava, and the steady Arab apothecaries of the early medieval centuries called it afyan, from which our modern English word opium descends. The careful Roman preparation, kept in a small dark stoppered glass bottle on the highest shelf, was made by dissolving a small patient pinch of the dried brown gum of the Theban poppy in a small clean clay jug of warm wine of the patient Falernian vintage, sweetened with a careful spoonful of clean honey, and steeped for a long week in the gentle warm shadows of the back room. The quiet preparation was strained, when ready, through a clean linen cloth, and decanted into the small dark stoppered glass bottle, and set carefully on the high shelf behind the iron grate, ready to be parted with by the small careful spoonful to a customer who came to the counter with a quiet trouble of the body that the long gentler herbs of the lower shelves had not been able to ease. The gentle preparation was given in a small, careful spoonful, in a patient cup of warm milk sweetened with a small steady spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who could not, by any other reach, find his way to sleep. The slow pain of the steady, broken bone, the gentle pain of the old tooth, the long pain of the gentle childbirth, the patient pain of the patient ending of life, all could be eased by the patient hand of the apothecary, with a small patient spoonful of the small careful preparation. The long Roman tradition reckoned the quiet preparation, like the gentle dark cousin of theriac itself, to be a quiet gift of the gentle gods and the patient apothecary at the counter, who had given many such small spoonfuls in his long career, kept the small dark bottle on the careful high shelf with a patient respect. The second of the sleep tonics was the steady preparation of the mandrake root. The mandrake of the careful Mediterranean dry hillside, the Mandragora officinarum of the patient modern botanist, is a small low plant of dark green leaves and small purple flowers and small yellow apple-like fruit, with a long forked taproot that, in the patient imagination of the long centuries, has often been held to look like a small human figure. The old folk tradition has held the mandrake to be a plant of quiet magical character. The slow Greek tradition said that to pull a mandrake from the careful soil was to release a gentle piercing scream that would, in some accounts, drive the quiet, unwary digger mad. The steady Roman tradition recommended that the careful gatherer should tie a gentle cord to the root, fasten the other end of the cord to a patient dog, and walk away, that the patient dog might pull the root from the careful soil and bear, in the place of the steady gatherer, the long burden of the careful piercing scream. These were, of course, patient stories. The careful Roman apothecary at the patient counter, who had pulled many a mandrake from the patient soil with his own careful hands, knew that the quiet root was a patient plant of the careful dry hillside that did not, in fact, scream at all. The old stories had grown up by the quiet inheritance, around the gentle real long effects of the careful root upon the steady body of the patient who took it. The careful root was, by every patient modern account, a patient-potent member of the careful nightshade family, containing the quiet tropane alkaloids that the gentle Roman apothecary, by patient observation, knew to be a careful strong sleep bringer and a gentle pain easer. The careful Roman preparation, kept in a small clay pot on the patient's highest shelf, was made by slow drying of the steady washed root in the careful warm shadows of the gentle back loft, by steady grinding of the patient dried root in the careful heavy bronze mortar, by long steeping of the long ground root in clean wine of the quiet Falernian vintage for an old week, by gentle straining through a clean linen cloth. The preparation was given in the smallest of gentle spoonfuls in a small careful cup of warm milk to the patient who could not, by the steady gentler reach of the lower shelves, find his way to sleep. The careful Roman surgeon, when he had to undertake a gentle longer operation, the patient setting of a careful broken thigh, the long drawing of a slow stone from the patient bladder, the steady amputation of a quiet crushed limb, would give, the careful evening before, a small spoonful of the gentle preparation to the careful, that the gentle sleep of the patient preparation might carry the patient gently through the long ordeal of the careful next morning. The third of the sleep tonics was the careful preparation of lettuce juice. The patient lettuce of the patient Roman garden, the Lactuca virosa of the careful modern botanist, is a patient tall, slender plant of the quiet, disturbed ground, with old pale green leaves and a quiet milky white sap that runs from the careful broken stem. The gentle Greek physician Dioscorides, in his slow work, devotes a patient chapter to the careful, many uses of the long lettuce, and notes the gentle sleep, bringing properties of the careful milky white sap. The Roman name for the patient preparation, lactucarium, comes from the careful Latin lac, the patient word for milk, in honor of the quiet milky white sap. The careful Roman preparation, kept in a small clay pot on the patient middle shelf, was made by quiet harvesting of the gentle tall lettuce in the steady days of summer, when the careful plant had run to gentle flower, by slow draining of the steady milky white sap into careful shallow earthenware dishes, by steady drying of the long sap in the patient warm sun until it had formed a careful brown brittle gum, by long crumbling of the gum into a small clay pot for storage. The quiet preparation was given, in the smallest of careful pinches, in a small patient cup of warm milk, sweetened with a gentle spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who could not, by any other gentler reach, find his way to sleep. The gentle preparation was, by every steady account, the careful gentlest of the sleep tonics, milder by far than the long opium of the patient highest shelf, milder by far than the careful mandrake of the highest shelf, and was the quiet first reach of the patient apothecary at the careful counter for the gentle restless customer. The fourth of the sleep tonics was the gentle preparation of valerian root. We have met the careful valerian before, in the patient first cupboard of the steady first night, where it sat as the gentle herb of the gentle sleeplessness. The Romans of the gentle late 2nd century knew the patient herb very well. The careful Greek physician Galen himself, in his long writings, devotes a patient chapter to the quiet, many uses of the careful valerian, and gives it the Greek name fou. The gentle Roman preparation, kept in a small linen bag on the careful middle shelf, was made by old digging of the patient root in the steady cool autumn, by gentle drying of the careful washed root in the gentle warm shadows, by patient chopping of the patient dried root into small pieces. The long preparation was given by way of a quiet cold infusion of a small quiet pinch of the careful chopped root in a small clay jug of cool water, set out in the gentle morning and steeped through the patient day, strained at the careful evening, sweetened with a small patient spoonful of clean honey, given in a small steady cup to the careful sleepless patient at the gentle close of the old day. The patient valerian, by quiet tradition, was the gentle reach of the apothecary for the slow restless night, and was reckoned by every long account to be the steady ancestor of the quiet modern valerian preparations of the careful country herbalist. The fifth of the sleep tonics was the careful preparation of henbane. The henbane, the hyoscyamus niger of the gentle modern botanist, is a careful, tall, coarse plant of the patient waste ground, with steady, broad, sticky leaves and careful pale yellow flowers veined with gentle dark purple. The patient Greek name hyoscyamus means the careful pig's bean, for the long pigs of the quiet Greek farmstead were said to eat the careful seeds with great pleasure and without harm, while the seeds were a gentle potent poison to almost every other careful animal. The patient Roman name was Apollinaris, the steady Apollo's herb, for the quiet sleep bringing properties of the careful preparation were reckoned by steady tradition to be a gentle gift of the patient god of healing. The careful Roman preparation, kept in a small clay pot on the quiet highest shelf behind the careful iron grate, was made by steady harvesting of the gentle tall plant in the gentle days of summer, by long drying of the gentle washed leaves in the careful warm shadows, by old grinding of the long dried leaves in the steady heavy bronze mortar, by gentle steeping of the careful ground leaves in clean olive oil for a patient week, by quiet straining through a clean linen cloth. The patient preparation was used in the careful smallest of patient drops on the quiet aching tooth by way of a gentle numbing helper for the long pain of the slow infection. The gentle preparation was also used in the gentle smallest of careful drops in a small steady cup of warm milk for the patient who in the patient course of an old illness could not, by any gentler reach of the cupboard, find a way to sleep. The patient Roman tradition kept the careful henbane on the patient highest shelf, behind the quiet iron grate, in honor of the careful potent character of the gentle preparation, and the patient apothecary at the gentle counter parted with the careful preparation, only to the long most trusted of the quiet customers, and only in the steady smallest of careful spoonfuls. The sixth of the sleep tonics was the careful soporific sponge. The patient soporific sponge is one of the careful great quiet inventions of the patient Roman medical tradition, and one that has come down to us by slow inheritance into the quiet early modern surgery. It was a careful natural sea sponge, gathered from the gentle Aegean coast by the gentle sponge, divers of the careful islands, dried in the long warm sun, and then soaked for a steady week in a steady warm preparation of opium, mandrake, hyoscyamus, lettuce, juice, and a careful pinch of crushed dried hemlock seed, all blended together with clean water and a small spoonful of clean honey. The patient sponge, when it had absorbed the long preparation, was dried again in the careful warm shadows and stored in a small clay box on the quiet highest shelf behind the careful iron grate. The careful Roman surgeon, when he had to undertake a steady operation upon a gentle patient, would, the patient evening before, Take down the careful soporific sponge, soak it in a small cup of warm water until it had softened, and lay it gently across the gentle patient's face, that the patient might breathe in the old rising vapors and pass, by the long minutes, into a long sleep. The careful surgeon would then undertake the gentle operation, the quiet setting of a broken thigh, the careful drawing of a long stone, the patient amputation, while the patient lay in the old sleep of the patient preparation. When the careful operation was done, the steady surgeon would remove the gentle sponge from the careful's face, and the patient would, in the gentle course of an hour or two, slowly come back to himself, often with no memory at all of the quiet ordeal that had passed. There is, in the slow tradition of the careful soporific sponge of the Roman surgeon, a patient inheritance that runs from the quiet, early Roman Empire, through the careful Byzantine medical centers of Constantinople and Alexandria, through the gentle Arab medical centers of Baghdad and Cairo, through the gentle Italian medical centers of Salerno and Bologna, into the careful early modern surgical tradition of Paris and London, where the long soporific sponge was still in steady occasional use as late as the careful 18th century, only to be slowly displaced in the patient 19th century by the careful modern preparations of patient chloroform and ether. The quiet soporific sponge of the careful Roman surgeon was, by steady inheritance, the steady ancestor of the gentle modern anesthetic. There is, in the gentle tradition of the gentle sleep tonics of the careful Roman apothecary's cupboard, a patient inheritance that runs from the steady Cretan poppy, goddesses of the late second millennium before Christ, through the careful Greek physicians of the gentle classical age, through the patient Roman apothecaries of the empire, through the careful Byzantine and Arab apothecaries of the medieval world, into the gentle preparations of the quiet, modern country herbalist, the gentle herbs of the sleep tonics, the gentle poppy, and the careful mandrake, and the patient lettuce, and the steady valerian, and the careful henbane, are, by long inheritance, the steady ancestors of the gentle many, gentle preparations of the patient modern world for the patient restless nights of the quiet weary. Let us turn now to the fifth recipe of the night. The fifth recipe is the careful tradition of the stomach remedies of the apothecary. We turn now to an old shelf that, in the quiet Roman world, was unusually well stocked. The careful Romans were a patient-eating people. The quiet Roman supper, the gentle cena, was the careful great social event of the gentle Roman day, beginning in the steady late afternoon and continuing in the careful well-to-do household well into the slow evening, with steady courses of long many dishes, patient many sauces, careful much wine, many guests reclining on the gentle couches of the quiet triclinium. The long Roman cookbook of Apicius, the careful late 4th century Dura Coquinaria, lists patient many hundreds of gentle elaborate dishes, careful many of which involve gentle rich combinations of steady many sauces, careful many spices, long much honey, patient much garum, the slow fermented fish, sauce of the careful Mediterranean kitchen. The careful natural consequence of the patient Roman supper, by quiet inheritance, was the old Roman stomach trouble. The patient Roman patient, on the careful morning after a quiet supper, would come to the gentle counter of the gentle apothecary's shop with the steady heaviness of the slow stomach, with the steady wind of the gentle bowels, with the long sour mouth of the patient indigestion, with the old aching head of the quiet, over-drinking. The slow stomach shelf of the careful apothecary's cupboard was, by steady tradition, one of the steady most often reached shelves in the long entire shop. The first of the stomach helpers was the careful preparation of fennel seed. We have met the patient fennel before, in the careful first cupboard of the first night, where it sat as the gentle helper of the quiet colicky baby. The careful Romans of the gentle late 2nd century knew the gentle herb very well, and the careful Roman preparation, kept in a small glass jar on the steady middle shelf, was made by long harvesting of the careful umbels of the tall plant in the patient late summer, by old drying in the careful warm shadows, by gentle stripping of the patient seeds from the quiet dried umbels, by patient storage in the small glass jar. The gentle preparation was given by way of a quiet infusion of a gentle crushed teaspoon of the careful seeds in a small cup of warm water, sweetened with a steady spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who came to the counter with the gentle heaviness of the long stomach, with the patient wind of the old bowels, with the quiet sour mouth of the slow indigestion. The patient preparation was, by steady tradition, the careful first reach of the patient apothecary at the patient counter for the gentle stomach trouble of the quiet, and the careful Roman cooks, by gentle inheritance, also added a gentle pinch of crushed fennel seed to careful many of their long elaborate dishes, that the long supper might pass more easily through the patient bowels of the steady guests. The second of the stomach helpers was the careful preparation of cumin seed. The cuminum simonum of the careful modern botanist, is a patient slender annual of the patient warm garden bed, with careful fine feathery leaves and small white umbels that gentle ripen by careful autumn into the small narrow ridged seeds we know today. The long Greek name, kimenon, comes from the careful older Semitic word kamen, by which we know that the steady seed traveled, by slow inheritance, from the Levantine kitchens of the careful late Bronze Age into the patient Greek kitchens of the patient Classical Age, and from there into the careful Roman kitchens of the quiet empire. The gentle Roman preparation, kept in a small glass jar on the gentle middle shelf, was used, by old tradition, as a long warming companion to the careful fennel seed, and was given, by way of a steady infusion, in a small cup of warm water sweetened with a spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who came to the patient counter with the quiet heaviness of a slow supper. The patient Roman cooks, by careful inheritance, also added a quiet pinch of crushed cumin to gentle many of their careful elaborate dishes, that the gentle warming character of the long spice might careful steady the steady bowels of the steady guests. The third of the stomach helpers was the careful preparation of mint, the gentle reach of the apothecary at the counter for the gentle sour mouth of the long indigestion. The patient Roman preparation, kept in a small linen bag on the patient middle shelf, was made by long harvesting of the quiet tall mint of the careful stream bank in the patient days of summer, by old drying of the gentle leaves in the gentle warm shadows, by gentle storage in the small linen bag. The long preparation was given, by way of a patient infusion of a steady pinch of the careful dried leaves in a small cup of warm water sweetened with a patient spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who came to the patient counter with the old sour mouth of the quiet indigestion. The quiet Roman tradition reckoned the careful mint to be the gentle helper of the slow stomach. And the gentle Romans, in their steady suppers, often closed the gentle meal with a small cup of mint, water by way of a gentle settling of the long bowels. The fourth of the stomach helpers was the steady preparation of wormwood. The wormwood, the Artemisia absinthium of the careful modern botanist, is a patient tall green plant of the patient dry hillside, with careful finely divided silver, green leaves and small yellow flower, heads in the quiet late summer. The careful Greek name, absinthian, gives us the long modern name absinthe, the gentle 19th century French liquor that was distilled from the careful herb. The Roman name, absinthium, gives us the steady modern English wormwood, by way of the patient Anglo-Saxon translation. The careful preparation was bitter. By every patient account, the patient preparation was, in fact, the careful most bitter preparation in the gentle entire apothecary's cupboard, and the patient who took the careful preparation took it with old resignation, knowing that the quiet bitterness of the long preparation was, by slow tradition, the gentle very strength of the careful preparation upon the steady sluggish stomach of the patient who had overeaten. The steady Roman preparation, kept in a small linen bag on the patient middle shelf, was given by way of a quiet infusion of a patient pinch of the careful dried leaves in a small cup of warm wine, to the patient who came to the careful counter with the gentle sluggish stomach of the long overeating. The long preparation was the gentle great reach of the careful Roman apothecary for the patient heavy supper, and was reckoned by old tradition to be a patient kindness to the quiet, suffering Roman bowels. The fifth of the stomach helpers was the careful great Hiera picra of Galen. The Hiera picra is, after the steady great theriac, the careful most famous compound preparation of the patient Galenic tradition. The patient Greek name, Hiera picra, means simply the careful sacred bitter, and the gentle preparation was, by slow tradition, the quiet great laxative of the careful Roman apothecary's cupboard. It was a long blend of gentle aloe, careful crushed dried cinnamon, crushed dried cardamom, steady crushed dried saffron, careful crushed dried mastic, and clean honey, all blended together over a steady charcoal flame in a clean bronze pot, scraped into a small alabaster jar, sealed with a gentle disc of wax, and stored on the quiet middle shelf of the apothecary's cupboard. The careful preparation was given in a small spoonful in a small cup of warm water sweetened with a careful spoonful of clean honey, to the patient who came to the steady counter with a steady stubborn complaint of the gentle bowels, with a long resistant constipation of the patient winter, with an old sluggish digestion of the quiet overeating. The careful preparation was the patient deeper, reaching helper of the patient Roman apothecary for the slow stubborn stomach trouble, and was reckoned by steady tradition to be the steady ancestor of the careful many laxative preparations of the modern pharmacy. The sixth of the stomach helpers was the quiet preparation of rue. The rue, the Ruta graveolens of the careful modern botanist, is a small woody shrub of the gentle Mediterranean garden, with small green divided leaves and small yellow four-petaled flowers. The steady Greek name Peganon and the careful Latin name Ruta both descend, by gentle inheritance, from a long older Indo-European root for the patient idea of bitterness. The careful Roman preparation, kept in a small linen bag on the quiet highest shelf, was used by long tradition in the careful smallest of patient pinches for the patient's stubborn, windy stomach of the old overeating, and for the quiet, sluggish digestion of the slow, heavy supper. The gentle Roman tradition kept the careful roux on the gentle, highest shelf in honor of the steady, potent character of the careful preparation. For the long preparation was, by every patient account, a careful, potent helper of the steady stomach, and was given only by gentle, experienced hand, only in the smallest of quiet pinches, only to the careful, most trusted of the long customers. The seventh of the stomach helpers was the careful preparation of the gentle watered wine, the patient posca, which we will meet again, in greater length, in the careful chapter on the steady recipes for the gentle legions of the empire. For now, it is enough to say that the careful posca was, by patient tradition, the patient first reach of the long Roman apothecary, for the old flushed stomach of the quiet fever, for the slow sour mouth of the steady indigestion, for the gentle weakness of the long summer heat. The careful posca was, by every quiet account, the gentle kindness of the careful Roman cupboard. There is, in the patient tradition of the gentle stomach remedies of the careful Roman apothecary's cupboard, a patient inheritance that runs from the steady Levantine kitchens of the careful late Bronze Age, through the gentle Greek physicians of the patient classical age, through the careful Roman apothecaries of the empire, into the gentle preparations of the quiet modern world, the careful warming seeds of the fennel and the gentle cumin and the careful coriander, the gentle leaves of the steady mint and the careful lemon balm and the gentle chamomile, the patient bitter leaves of the careful wormwood and the long rue and the quiet gentian are, by old inheritance, the steady ancestors of the careful many gentle preparations of the modern country herbalist for the quiet stomach troubles of the slow supper. The patient apothecary at the long counter, who has now finished with the stomach remedies, turns slowly to the next jar on the shelf. The lamp burns steadily. The frankincense in the small bronze brazier on the floor sends up its slow thin curl of pale, grey smoke. The gentle evening is far advanced, and the steady Roman city outside the careful narrow doorway has begun, in its gentle way, to settle into the quiet of the careful Roman night. There is no hurry at all. Let us turn now to the sixth recipe of the night. The sixth recipe is the tradition of the eye washes and the eye unguents of the apothecary. We turn now to a small and particular shelf of the Roman cupboard, the shelf of the eye preparations. The Roman world was, in many quiet ways, a world that troubled the eyes. The dust of the long roads, raised by the carts and the legions, and the long flocks of sheep, settled into the eyes of the travelers. The smoke of the kitchen fires, drifting through the small, high windows of the insulae, irritated the eyes of the city dwellers. The salt spray of the long sea voyages settled into the eyes of the sailors. The strong light of the southern Mediterranean sun, reflected from the white stone of the temples and the marble of the public squares, wearied the eyes of all who walked beneath it. The long evenings spent reading by the small flicker of an olive oil lamp in the libraries of the senators and the small studies of the scholars slowly tired the eyes of the readers. The Roman world had its share of eye troubles, and the apothecary's cupboard kept its quiet shelf of eye remedies for them. The first of the eye preparations was the simple eye wash of clean water and rose petals. It was the gentlest of the cupboard and the first reach of the apothecary for any small irritation of the patient's eye. a small handful of dried rose petals was steeped for a slow quarter of an hour in a small clay jug of clean, cool water that had been boiled and allowed to cool to the temperature of the body. The rose water was strained, when ready, through a clean linen cloth and stored in a small dark glass bottle on the middle shelf of the cupboard. The Roman customer who came to the counter with a small irritated eye, with a small grain of dust that would not wash out, with a small angry redness from the long smoke of a kitchen fire, would receive a small dark glass bottle of the rose water, with the patient instruction to bathe the eye with a small clean linen cloth 3 times a day until the small irritation had settled. The second of the eye preparations was the famous collyrium. The collyrium is one of the great quiet inventions of the Roman pharmacy, and one that has come down to us by long inheritance in the small bronze stamps with which the Roman oculists marked their preparations. A collyrium was a small dry stick of compounded ingredients, formed by mixing the powdered herbs and minerals with a little gum and water into a thick paste, rolling the paste into a small cylindrical stick the size of a man's little finger, drying the stick in the warm shadows and stamping the dried stick with a small bronze stamp that bore the name of the maker, the name of the preparation, and the eye, trouble for which it was intended. When the patient came to the counter, the apothecary or oculist would scrape a small steady pinch of the dried stick into a small cup of warm water or warm milk, would mix it slowly with a small bronze stirrer, and would either give the preparation to the patient to bathe the eye with a small clean linen cloth, or would, in the more serious cases, drop the preparation directly into the eye with a small bronze pipette. The bronze stamps of the Roman oculists have been recovered by the patient archaeology of the modern centuries in their hundreds, scattered across the long territories of the empire. They are small, flat, rectangular blocks of bronze, perhaps 3 fingers across, with the careful names of the preparations engraved into the careful narrow edges in tiny mirror image Latin letters. The names are wonderful: the Dialibanum, the Diasmunis, the Diapsoricum, the Crocodes, the Basilicum. Each name describes the principal ingredient: the saffron preparation, the myrrh preparation, the cucumber seed preparation. The stamps have come down to us from Britain, from Gaul, from Spain, from Italy, from Greece, from North Africa, from Asia Minor. The Roman oculist was a familiar figure in every corner of the empire. The most famous of the collyrium recipes was the patient preparation of Asclepiades. It was a blend of crushed dried saffron, of crushed dried myrrh, of crushed dried frankincense, of crushed dried opium, of crushed dried verdigris, of crushed dried zinc oxide, all bound together with a small spoonful of clean acacia gum and a small careful pinch of clean rose water. The careful preparation was rolled into the small cylindrical stick, dried, stamped, and stored in a small clay box on the middle shelf of the apothecary's cupboard. It was the great reach of the apothecary for the more serious eye troubles, for the long red eye of the slow infection, for the long grey film that crept across the eye of the elderly, for the long itching of the small chronic conjunctivitis. The third of the eye preparations was the simple eye unguent of saffron and honey. It was kept in a small alabaster pot on the middle shelf and was made by warming clean honey gently over a small charcoal flame, stirring in a small quiet pinch of crushed dried saffron threads until the honey had taken on a deep amber color, allowing the preparation to cool and storing it in the small alabaster pot. The careful preparation was applied, in the smallest of careful pinches, with the patient tip of a small bronze spatula, to the inside of the lower eyelid of the patient, who suffered from a long stubborn dryness of the eye, from a long sore eye that had been wearied by long reading, from a long irritated eye that had been troubled by the long smoke of a small lamp. The saffron, by long tradition, was reckoned to soothe the long irritated eye, and the gentle honey was reckoned to draw out the small angry redness and to calm the long dry surface. The fourth of the eye preparations was the famous preparation of cucumber seeds. The Greek physician Dioscorides, in his patient work, devotes a particular chapter to the cooling properties of the cucumber, and recommends a careful preparation of crushed dried cucumber seeds for the old inflamed eye of the patient's summer fever. The steady Roman preparation was made by patient harvesting of the ripe cucumbers in the careful late summer, by quiet extraction of the gentle seeds, by slow drying of the patient seeds in the careful warm shadows, by steady grinding of the long dried seeds in the quiet, heavy bronze mortar to a careful fine pale powder, by long blending of the powder with a gentle spoonful of clean acacia gum and a careful pinch of clean rose water into a patient soft cool paste. The steady paste was applied with the patient tip of a small bronze spatula to the closed eyelid of the patient who had taken an old fever, by way of a gentle cooling helper for the quiet heat of the slow inflammation. The fifth of the eye preparations was the small slow zinc oxide unguent. The patient Roman apothecary kept, in a small clay pot on the careful middle shelf, a small patient supply of clean white zinc oxide, prepared by the old burning of metallic zinc or in a clean clay furnace, with the careful pale white smoke being collected, by steady tradition, on a clean linen sheet stretched across the gentle upper opening of the careful furnace, where the long smoke would settle, in the gentle course of an hour or two, into a steady pale white powder. The careful powder was scraped by patient hand into the small clay pot, and was used, by gentle tradition, as a gentle drying helper for the long weeping eye, for the patient irritated eyelid, for the old sore at the corner of the quiet, suffering eye. The careful preparation was a quiet blend of clean white zinc oxide, of clean white beeswax, of clean olive oil, and of a patient pinch of clean rose water. The careful 4 ingredients were blended together over a patient charcoal flame, stirred slowly with a slow bronze stirrer until they had blended into a gentle soft pale white cream, scraped into a small alabaster pot and sealed, when cool, with a careful disc of wax. The steady preparation was applied in the long smallest of careful pinches, with the patient tip of a small bronze spatula, to the steady sore eyelid of the patient. The careful preparation was a gentle reach of the patient Roman apothecary for the gentle irritated eye, and was reckoned, by long tradition, to be a steady ancestor of the careful many zinc oxide preparations of the gentle modern pharmacy. There is, in the patient tradition of the eye preparations of the careful Roman apothecary's cupboard, a patient inheritance that runs from the steady Egyptian temple physicians of the late 2nd millennium before Christ, through the careful Greek physicians of the gentle classical age, through the patient Roman oculists of the empire, through the careful Byzantine and Arab oculists of the long medieval centuries, into the gentle preparations of the careful modern ophthalmologist. The clean rose water, the clean saffron, the clean zinc oxide are by old inheritance the steady ancestors of the patient, many gentle preparations of the steady modern world for the quiet, irritated eye of the slow, reading scholar, of the steady, marching legionary, of the gentle, grieving widow, of the long, weary traveller upon the patient road. The careful Roman oculist himself was a patient particular figure of the patient Roman world. He travelled by old tradition with a small wooden box that held the small collection of the quiet collyrium sticks, the small bronze stamp with which the long sticks had been marked, a small bronze pipette for the quiet application of the careful preparations to the quiet, suffering eye, a small bronze probe for the quiet inspection of the slow, irritated eyelid, a small lens of clear rock crystal, ground and polished, for the quiet magnification of the quiet work upon the quiet eye. The careful Roman oculist set up his small stall in the small market squares of the quiet Roman towns, hung out his small painted sign of the quiet staring eye, and waited for the quiet customer to come to him with the long trouble of the quiet, suffering eye. The most famous of the quiet Roman oculists was a quiet Greek freedman named Demosthenes Philolithus, who served at the quiet court of the quiet Emperor Nero in the quiet 1st century, and who wrote a long treatise on the quiet diseases of the quiet eye that has, unfortunately, been lost to us, but that is mentioned with quiet respect by the quiet Galen of Pergamon in his long writings. The quiet Roman tradition of the quiet oculist was, by quiet long inheritance, the slow ancestor of the quiet modern profession of the quiet ophthalmologist, and the quiet Roman bronze stamps, recovered by the patient archaeology of the quiet modern centuries, are the quiet evidence of the long inheritance. Let us turn now to the 7th recipe of the night. The 7th recipe is the tradition of the skin and beauty preparations of the apothecary. We turn now to a long shelf that, in the careful Roman Empire, was unusually long. The quiet Romans, both men and women, paid an unusual degree of attention to the steady care of the body, to the patient's soft skin, to the clean teeth, to the gentle, well-tended hair, to the steady fragrance of the careful, well-kept body. The steady Roman tradition of the baths, with the long caldarium and the steady tepidarium and the long frigidarium, brought the Roman body, on a careful daily basis, into the gentle unguent room, where the patient unguentarius blended the long perfumed oils of the Roman day, to walk through the careful narrow streets of the quiet Roman city in the patient late afternoon, when the careful Romans returned in their patient groups from the gentle baths to their old suppers, was to walk through an old procession of gentle scents, of gentle spikenard and careful saffron and steady rose and long frankincense and careful myrrh, drifting on the patient warm air from the well-oiled bodies of the careful patrician matrons and the quiet young senators returning from the long bath. The first of the skin preparations was the quiet Roman face cream, the nardus. The nardus was a careful preparation of clean white beeswax, of clean white olive oil, of clean white spikenard oil from the patient Indian highland trade, and of clean clear rose water from the local distillery. The gentle 4 ingredients were blended together over a slow charcoal flame in a clean small bronze pot, stirred until they had blended into a careful pale yellow cream, cooled, scraped into a small alabaster pot, and sealed with a steady wax sealed lid. The careful preparation was kept in the quiet unguent room of the long Roman matron's well-kept dressing table. The patient Roman matron, in the long evening before bed, would take a small pinch of the patient nardus on the patient tip of her little finger and spread it slowly across the careful soft skin of her face, of her neck, of her slow arms, by way of a long kindness to the steady skin at the slow end of the gentle day. The gentle spikenard from the gentle Indian highland gave the careful preparation a steady, heavy, warm scent that, by the long tradition of the long Roman matron, was the long kindness of the steady well-kept body to itself at the long close of the long day. The second of the skin preparations was the careful Roman lip salve, the labrum. The labrum was a careful preparation of clean white beeswax, of clean white olive oil, and of clean dried rose petals. The patient three ingredients were blended together over a slow charcoal flame in a clean small bronze pot, stirred until they had blended into a patient soft pink cream, strained through a clean linen cloth to remove the petals, cooled and scraped into a small horn pot. The gentle Roman matron kept the labrum in a small pouch on her dressing table and spread a small pinch slowly across the gentle soft long lips at the patient end of the patient day. The third of the skin preparations was the careful Roman hand cream, the manus. The manus was a steady preparation of clean white beeswax, of clean white olive oil, of clean white almond oil, and of clean, clear distilled water of the careful pale orange flowers of the sweet citrus tree of the patient southern Italian garden. The patient four ingredients were blended together over a slow charcoal flame, stirred until they had blended into a careful pale yellow cream, cooled and scraped into a small alabaster pot. The quiet Roman matron spread a small pinch slowly across the long, soft, gentle hands at the quiet end of the old day, by way of quiet kindness to the slow hands of a steady house full of slow daily work. The fourth of the skin preparations was the careful Roman bath oil, the unguentum. The unguentum was the careful great long tradition of the steady Roman bath, kept in small narrow, necked alabaster flasks of careful several colors and several sizes, blended in quiet turn by the gentle unguentarius from a long catalogue of steady blends, each one named for a careful particular preparation. There was the gentle rhodinum, the long blend of olive oil and rose. There was the long melanum, the old blend of olive oil and quince. There was the patient crocynum, the gentle blend of olive oil and saffron. There was the old sampsocinum, the patient blend of olive oil and marjoram. There was the quiet nardum, the quiet blend of olive oil and spikenard. And there was the great regale unguentum, the slow royal unguent, the slow blend of quiet many ingredients, including spikenard, saffron, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, cardamom, balsam, storax, styrax, and malabathrum, blended together by the steady unguentarius in the gentle palace pharmacy of the long imperial court, in such tiny quantities, in such great expense, that a careful single small alabaster flask of it, in the gentle late 1st century, would cost a laborer a careful full year's wages. The fifth of the skin preparations was the steady Roman cosmetic, the cerussa paste. The cerussa paste was a careful preparation of the patient pale white lead that we have already met in the patient white salve, blended with clean honey, with clean olive oil, with clean rose water, and with crushed dried rose petals. The careful Roman matron spread a gentle pale white preparation slowly across the quiet soft careful skin of her face, by way of long kindness to the long smoothness of the skin. The gentle pale white preparation gave the careful Roman matron her pale lily, white skin of the Roman ideal of steady beauty. There is, of course, the same shadow over the cerasa paste that we met in the white salve. The careful pale white lead, spread on the soft patient skin of the careful Roman matron through the patient days of the gentle Roman year, gave her, by the quiet guess of the modern medical historian, an old chronic lead poisoning that, in the quiet course of the careful Roman year, sometimes brought her early into the slow winter of the steady body. We will let the long shadow rest here too, in the long back room. The sixth of the skin preparations was the gentle Roman depilatory, the psilothron. The psilothron was a careful preparation of pitch and honey, blended together over a slow charcoal flame, applied warm to the patient's skin of the steady legs and the careful arms by the gentle Roman matron at the steady bath, allowed to cool, and then peeled slowly away, taking the old body hair of the careful Roman matron with it. The long Roman matron, who was much given to quiet, slow baths, much given to careful, steady cosmetics, and much given to gentle smoothness of the skin, kept her body free of gentle body hair from the careful neck down to the patient ankles by the patient daily use of this slow preparation. The seventh of the skin preparations was the steady Roman hair tonic, the capilliferum. The capilliferum was a careful preparation of olive oil and the patient's soft black juice of the patient dried green walnut husk, blended together over an old charcoal flame, applied to the careful hair of the gentle Roman matron in the gentle warm hour of the quiet afternoon, by way of long care for the careful color and the long gloss of the hair. The gentle Roman matron was much given to long care for the careful hair, and the patient apothecary's cupboard kept several slow tonics of this kind, each one for a steady, slightly different shade. There were quiet tonics for the patient black hair, for the patient brown hair, for the patient rare old red hair, and for the quiet pale blonde hair, which was, by the old Roman tradition, the careful most prized of all, for it was the gentle color of the quiet Germanic captives, whose slow pale braids were sometimes cut and sold to the long Roman matrons at the steady slave markets of the careful imperial capital. The eighth of the skin preparations was the careful Roman tooth powder, the dentifrice. The dentifrice was a steady preparation of crushed bone, ash, of crushed oyster shell, of crushed dried mint, and of a small patient pinch of clean fine charcoal, blended together in a small careful dry mortar, stored in a small quiet clay pot on the careful dressing table. The long Roman matron, in the slow morning, took a small pinch of the dentifrice on the careful tip of a small clean linen cloth, and rubbed slowly the clean teeth, and rinsed slowly the clean mouth with a small patient cup of clean water and dried mint. The careful Roman teeth, by every account of the gentle Roman writers, were unusually clean and unusually white, and the quiet Roman dentifrice was much copied through the quiet centuries. The ninth of the skin preparations was the careful Roman incense, the suffamentum. The suffamentum was a steady preparation of crushed frankincense, of crushed myrrh, of crushed storax, and of a small pinch of crushed cinnamon, blended together in a small patient clay box, kept on a quiet shelf in the gentle living room, and burned, a small pinch at a time, on a small careful brazier in the quiet evening hour, by way of the long sweetening of the patient air of the long Roman household. There is, In the old tradition of the careful Roman skin and beauty preparations, a quiet inheritance of the long Egyptian tradition that came up through the quiet Greek world and into Rome through the patient trade with Alexandria. The quiet tradition has come down to us in many patient pieces, in the patient writings of the careful Greek physicians, Dioscorides and Galen, in the quiet writings of the gentle Roman authors Pliny and Celsus, and in the patient archaeological remains of the careful Roman dressing tables of Pompeii and Herculaneum, where the small long alabaster pots and the small patient glass flasks have been preserved by the patient ash of Vesuvius for the quiet instruction of the quiet modern museum, Goa. The patient apothecary at the slow counter, who has now finished with the steady shelf of the careful skin and beauty preparations, turns slowly to the quiet next jar on the quiet shelf. The quiet lamp burns quiet steadily. The quiet frankincense in the small bronze brazier on the careful floor sends up its slow thin curl of careful pale grey smoke. The quiet Roman city outside the quiet, narrow doorway has settled, in its slow way, into the long of the quiet Roman night. There is no quiet hurry at all. Let us turn now to the 8th recipe of the night. The 8th recipe is the tradition of the recipes for the legions of the Roman Empire. We turn now to a particular shelf of the apothecary's cupboard, the long catalogue of the preparations made specifically for the Roman legions of the imperial frontier. The Roman Empire was held together in the late 2nd century by 28 legions, each of perhaps 5,000 and more soldiers, stationed in long camps along the frontiers of the empire, on the Rhine and the Danube, on the Euphrates and the Mauritanian sand line on the British wall. Together, the legions numbered perhaps 140,000 soldiers, each one fed and clothed and marched and bandaged and tended by the long medical service of the Roman army. The Roman army medical service was, in the late 2nd century, the most advanced medical organization in the ancient world. Each legion had its valetudinarium, a military hospital, a long stone building of perhaps 100 clean beds set in the center of the camp, equipped with the surgical kit of the army surgeon, with the apothecary's cupboard of the army apothecary, with the steady supply of clean linen bandages, of clean honey, of clean wine, of clean oil, of dried herbs from the long supply trains of the Roman army. The valetudinaria of the Roman frontier camps were, by every honest indication, the steady ancestors of the modern military hospital. The first of the legionary preparations was the gentle watered wine vinegar, the posca. The posca was the great drink of the Roman legionary on the long campaign. It was a simple preparation of 1 part vinegar to 4 parts clean cool water, sometimes sweetened with a spoonful of honey, sometimes seasoned with a pinch of dried thyme. The Roman soldier, on his long marches across the dry hills of southern Spain, across the burning sands of the African frontier, across the long parched ridges of the Anatolian plateau, drank his daily ration of posca by way of preservation against the long heat. The vinegar was reckoned, by the long observation of the army surgeons, to settle the stomach, to slow the spread of small wound infections, and to keep the body steady through the long burning afternoon. There is a small detail in the Gospel of St. Matthew, in the careful Christian tradition, of a Roman soldier offering a sponge soaked in posca to a man dying upon a cross. The detail, far from being a cruelty as some have read it, was in fact a small ordinary kindness, the offering of the soldier's own daily ration to a man in great thirst, the only thing the soldier had at hand to give. The second of the legionary preparations was the surgical bandage roll, the fascia. The Roman army surgeon kept, in his careful surgical kit, a long roll of clean linen bandage, prepared by the slow weavers of the imperial supply chain in the steady Egyptian linen, towns of the lower Nile, dyed pale buff with a small pinch of crushed dried saffron, washed and dried and rolled into gentle compact rolls of perhaps 6 feet in length, and stored in the patient's surgical kit beside the careful bronze instruments. The long bandage roll was used, by patient tradition, for the patient binding of the old wound, for the gentle binding of the careful broken bone, for the quiet binding of the long sprained ankle, for the careful binding of any quiet trouble of the gentle body that asked for the steady support of the clean linen. The third of the legionary preparations was the steady theriac of the army surgeon. We have met the careful theriac before, in the patient first chapter of the night, where it sat as the patient great compound preparation of the careful Roman cupboard. The gentle army surgeons of the quiet empire kept, in their careful surgical kits, a small alabaster jar of gentle theriac, prepared by the careful palace pharmacy of the imperial capital and shipped by slow supply train to the steady frontier camps of the careful empire. The patient army surgeon would, when a patient soldier was bitten by a careful poisonous serpent on the steady march, when a gentle soldier was wounded in a gentle battle, when a quiet soldier was struck down by a steady plague in the long camp, give the careful soldier a small spoonful of the gentle theriac in a small cup of warm wine, by way of the great compound helper of the steady Roman cupboard. The careful theriac was, by patient tradition, the patient first reach of the patient army surgeon for the careful most serious of the old troubles of the gentle Roman soldier. The fourth of the legionary preparations was the quiet surgeon's hemostatic, the careful alum styptic. The careful alum styptic was a gentle preparation of crushed dried alum, blended with a patient pinch of crushed dried sage and a careful pinch of crushed dried yarrow. The steady Roman army surgeon kept the gentle preparation in a small clean horn box in his patient surgical kit, sprinkled it carefully on any long bleeding wound, and watched the careful bleeding stop. The quiet alum carried in itself the steady astringent principle that careful drew the gentle tissue of the patient wound to a careful, tight closing. And the steady yarrow and the gentle sage carried in themselves the gentle, helping principles of the long herbs. The fifth of the legionary preparations was the clean honey of the careful army surgeon. We have met the clean honey before, in the careful chapter of the patient wound salves, where it sat as the gentle great patient helper of the quiet wound. The careful army surgeons of the gentle empire kept, in their steady surgical kits, a small clay pot of clean honey, gathered from the patient country bee, keepers of the careful regions through which the legion passed. The quiet army surgeon would, when a careful soldier came to the patient surgeon's tent with a gentle open wound, clean the careful wound with clean wine, scrape away any steady dirt or debris with a small clean bronze pick, inspect the long place under the patient lamp, and spoon a careful thick layer of the clean honey directly onto the quiet wound. The careful wound was then bound with a clean linen bandage and was left, by slow tradition, for 2 or 3 days before being unwrapped and inspected. The sixth of the legionary preparations was the gentle soporific sponge of the army surgeon. We have met the careful soporific sponge before, in the patient chapter of the sleep tonics, where it sat as the steady great patient helper of the careful Roman surgeon. The gentle army surgeons of the patient empire kept, in their careful surgical kits, a small clay box that held a small collection of the careful soporific sponges prepared by the palace pharmacy of the gentle imperial capital and shipped, by steady supply train, to the careful frontier camps of the patient empire. The steady army surgeon would, when a careful soldier had to undergo a gentle operation, the gentle setting of a patient broken thigh, the careful drawing of a long arrow, the patient amputation of a long crushed limb. Soak a quiet soporific sponge in a small cup of warm water, lay it gently across the soldier's face, and undertake the old operation while the gentle soldier lay in the quiet sleep of the careful preparation. The seventh of the legionary preparations was the careful preparation of garum, the famous Roman fish sauce. The garum was, in fact, the steady, great, everyday seasoning of the careful Roman kitchen, the long fermented brine of small fish, prepared by the slow fermentation of patient, crushed fish in careful clay vats with clean salt and clean water for an old period of careful many months. The long preparation was, by every gentle account, a careful potent source of nutrition, steady rich in salt, in protein, in the careful natural amino acids of the steady fermentation. The patient Roman army surgeon kept, in his patient surgical kit, a small clay pot of clean garum, and used it by gentle tradition, as a gentle helper of the gentle appetite of the careful sick soldier, as a steady reach for the patient weak stomach of the gentle soldier returning from a long fever. The careful Roman army medical service was, by every patient account, a steady ancestor of the careful modern military medical service. The patient bandages, the clean wine for cleaning the patient wound, the careful honey poultices, the long soporific sponges, the quiet alum styptics, the careful valetudinaria, are all the steady ancestors of the gentle modern hospital, of the careful modern surgery, of the patient modern pharmacy. The steady tradition is one of the quiet inheritances of the careful Roman cupboard. There is, in the old tradition of the recipes for the careful legions of the patient empire, a patient kindness that has come down to us in the quiet written record of the careful army surgeons. The quiet Greek physician Galen himself, in his slow writings, devotes a steady chapter to the gentle surgical practice of the careful Roman army surgeons, and the gentle Roman writer Pedanius Dioscorides, who served as a long army surgeon under the careful Emperor Nero, devotes the steady whole of his gentle work to the many herbs and careful many minerals of the patient military apothecary's cupboard. There were, beneath the careful great names, the patient many ordinary army surgeons of the quiet empire, the careful capsarii and the gentle medici castrensis, the gentle field surgeons and the careful camp doctors who carried, by long tradition, the patient catalogue of the long military medicine in their patient heads. They walked the old lines of the steady sick beds in the careful valetudinaria of the quiet frontier camps, with the small lamp and the quiet linen and the patient hand. By slow turn through the slow Roman year, easing the steady wounds and the gentle fevers of the careful Roman soldiers, by way of a patient kindness that the long centuries have not entirely forgotten. Let us turn now to the ninth recipe of the night. The ninth recipe is the tradition of the esoteric and the magical recipes of the apothecary. We turn now, in this last hour of the night, shop to a particular shelf that the apothecary at the long counter would smile a small smile at, but would also slowly respect, for the long tradition of 2,000 years lay quietly behind it. The shelf is the long catalogue of the esoteric and the magical recipes of the Roman apothecaries' cupboard, the patient preparations whose effectiveness was, even by the apothecary's own admission, an open question. The line between medicine and magic in the ancient world was a long, thin one, and the apothecary at the counter walked it very carefully every day of his long life. The first of the magical recipes was the amulet of the wolf's tooth. The Roman tradition, inherited from the older Etruscan tradition of the central Italian peninsula, said that the tooth of a wolf, hung on a small leather thong around the neck of a teething child, would ease the long pain of the slow teething. The apothecary at the counter kept, in a small clay box on the highest shelf, a small collection of wolves' teeth gathered from the long woods of the Sabine hills above the imperial capital. A tooth, a leather thong, a small knot, a quiet blessing whispered by the apothecary in the patient ear of the Roman matron at the counter, and the matron carried home a small kindness for the long teething of the Roman child. The patient observation of the centuries, by the patient apothecaries themselves, was that some children for whom the amulet was hung found their teething easier, and some did not. The patient apothecary did not promise, he merely offered. The old tradition was, by every honest reckoning, a quiet thread of hope as much as it was a thread of medicine. The second of the magical recipes was the quiet tradition of the herbs gathered at the full moon. The quiet tradition, inherited from the older Greek tradition of the rhizotomi, the root cutters, said that herbs gathered at the full moon, with the proper words whispered, with the proper offerings laid at the base of the plant, would carry more strength than herbs gathered in the daylight. The careful apothecary at the counter kept, in a small linen bag on the middle shelf, a patient collection of herbs gathered in the proper way, at the proper time, and these gentle herbs were dispensed, very quietly, very respectfully, to the patient customer who had asked for them, with a patient explanation that the gentle particular preparation, having been gathered in this steady particular way, was reckoned, by the slow tradition, to carry the slow particular strength of the gentle silver moon. The careful apothecary did not, by every long account, fully believe the tradition himself, but he did not, by every patient account, fully disbelieve it either. He kept the small bag in its place on the quiet middle shelf, and the steady tradition was honored in the patient way of the gentle centuries. The third of the magical recipes was the long tradition of Pliny's stranger entries. The careful Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his patient natural history of the gentle late 1st century, devotes an old catalogue of patient, many chapters to the careful many strange entries of the steady Roman folk medicine. There is the gentle recipe of careful boiled snail, shells for the quiet headache. There is the patient recipe of long crushed earthworms in honey for the slow stomach. There is the careful recipe of quiet dried scorpion, tail for the steady fever. There is the recipe of the careful 7-leaved clover, gathered at the gentle proper time, with the patient proper words, for the gentle luck. There is the careful recipe of steady crushed bat, wings for the long dim sightedness. There is the gentle recipe of the careful tongue of a fox, dried and ground, for the patient tongue-tied child. There is the long recipe of the careful shed skin of a serpent, wrapped about the quiet temples of one troubled by long headache. There are many dozens of such entries in the patient pages of the careful encyclopedia, gathered by the gentle Pliny from every corner of the patient empire, recorded with a patient credulity that has charmed and troubled the old readers of the steady work for 2,000 years. The careful apothecary at the counter, who had read his patient Pliny carefully, would, when asked, slowly explain that some of these patient recipes had been observed by the quiet observation of the centuries to help the patient sometimes, and that some of them had been observed to help the patient very rarely, and that some of them, the quiet apothecary admitted with a small smile, had perhaps never helped the patient at all. But the gentle apothecary, who was a patient man, would also slowly say that the slow folk tradition of the centuries had its own kind of patient wisdom, and that the Roman matron who believed in the steady recipe was perhaps already half way to the small kindness it might bring her. The careful body, the patient apothecary knew, was a steady mystery, and the patient belief of the patient was sometimes, in itself, a steady medicine. The fourth of the magical recipes was the careful prayer over the medicine. The quiet Roman apothecary, when dispensing a careful particular preparation, would, for the patient most serious of the long troubles, slowly whisper a patient prayer over the careful preparation as he handed it across the counter. The gentle prayer was usually addressed to the steady god Asclepius, the gentle healer, god of the ancient world, whose long great mother temple stood on the small island in the slow middle of the Tiber. The patient prayer was a simple one. May the careful god Asclepius, in his gentle kindness, bless the preparation. May the long body of the patient slowly accept it. May the patient trouble slowly settle. The careful prayer was, in its patient way, the patient apothecary's slow acknowledgement that the old medicine, however well prepared, was only careful half of the quiet healing, and that the gentle other half lay quietly with the slow body of the patient itself, and with the steady kindness of the gentle gods. The fifth of the magical recipes was the careful tradition of the lucky herbs of the household. The patient Roman household, by gentle tradition, kept a small collection of patient lucky herbs in the small lararium beside the careful kitchen door, where the small gentle household gods were honored with a patient daily offering of clean wine and clean bread. The steady lucky herbs included the careful sprig of vervain, hung above the door against the patient evil eye, the careful sprig of bay laurel, hung above the patient hearth against the quiet lightning of the careful summer storm, the gentle sprig of rue, hung above the gentle child's cradle against the careful evil whispers of the long neighbors, the steady sprig of fennel, laid upon the careful threshold against the ill fortune of the long year. The patient sprigs were renewed by patient tradition at the careful first day of each Roman month, the patient calends, when the quiet matron of the careful household took down the old sprigs, burned them in the small brazier with a small offering of clean wine, and hung long new sprigs in their steady place. The careful tradition was, by every account, less a patient tradition of medicine than a careful tradition of old household kindness, and the patient apothecary at the quiet counter sold the careful sprigs by the small bunch. on the gentle last day of each careful Roman month, to the long Roman matrons who came to the steady counter for them. There is, in the quiet tradition of the careful esoteric and the patient magical recipes of the patient Roman apothecary's cupboard, a slow humility that has come down to us, very quietly, through the steady centuries. The patient apothecary at the gentle counter, however learned in the gentle Galenic tradition, however practiced in the long Dioscoridian herbal, however well versed in the patient four humours of Hippocrates, knew very quietly that the old body and the quiet heart of the patient were a slow mystery, and that the steady medicine that he dispensed across the counter was only ever careful half of the gentle healing. The long other half, the gentle apothecary knew, lay quietly in the long mystery of the careful body and the patient mystery of the heart, and the patient apothecary slowly respected that old mystery for what it was. The careful Roman world, in the patient late 2nd century, stood at the quiet crossroads of patient many traditions, the careful Greek and the gentle Egyptian, and the quiet Persian, and the careful Etruscan, and the long Celtic, and the quiet many local traditions of the quiet many provinces of the quiet empire. The quiet esoteric, and the quiet magical recipes of the quiet apothecary's cupboard drew, by slow inheritance, from all of these quiet many sources, and the patient apothecary at the counter, who held them all in his steady head, walked the long thin line between the quiet medicine and the quiet magic with a patient kindness that has come down to us, very quietly through the long centuries. There is, also, the strange small recipe of the snake, skin slow, the cast skin of a serpent, dried and powdered, which Pliny describes as a gentle binder of the bowels of the elderly. There is the strange small recipe of the burnt coral, ground to a fine pink dust, mixed with honey, given as a tooth powder for those who suffered from the slow loosening of the gums. There is the recipe of the smoke of dried laurel leaves, drawn into the lungs through a small clay pipe, recommended for the long melancholy of those who could not, in the long winter months, find their way back to good cheer. The pages of Pliny are full of such gentle small recipes, and the patient apothecary at the counter, who had read them all, would, when asked, explain each one slowly, with the small smile of a man who knew the difference between knowledge and certainty, and who kept faith with both. There is, in the long catalogue of the magical recipes of the Roman cupboard, a small note that it is worth pausing on. The Romans, by long inheritance, did not draw the sharp line that the modern world tries to draw between medicine and prayer, between the slow herb and the small charm, between the work of the careful hand and the work of the patient heart. The Roman household, in its small daily way, kept the lararium beside the kitchen door, with its small clay figures of the household gods, with its small clay lamps, with its small offerings of clean wine and clean bread laid down at the morning and at the evening of every day of the year. The Roman temple, in its great public way, kept the long porticos for the long sleeping sick, with the slow ritual baths, with the small offerings, with the slow dream incubation. The Roman apothecary, in his patient daily way, kept the small alabaster jars of the great compound preparations, and the small linen bags of the dried herbs, and the small clay pots of the simple unguents, alongside the small box of the wolf's teeth, and the small bag of the moon, gathered herbs, and the small leather pouch of the inscribed amulets. The patient apothecary did not see these as separate kinds of medicine. They were, by long inheritance, all parts of the same long quiet kindness of the Roman world to the long sick body of the patient. The modern reader, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has sometimes been quick to mock the small magical recipes of the Roman apothecary. The modern reader has been less quick to notice that the Roman apothecary himself, who lived long before the great chemical and bacteriological discoveries of the 19th century, was working, in his slow, patient way, with what he had. He had the long inheritance of 2,000 years of patient observation. He had the slow body of the patient before him. He had the small herbs of the cupboard. He had, by long inheritance, the gentle prayers of the older traditions. He had, by his own long honest reckoning, no certainty that any one of these things would, on any one day, with any one patient, work. He had, instead, the long quiet hope of the slow centuries, that something in the long catalogue of the cupboard might, by the gentle kindness of the gentle gods, ease the long trouble of the slow body of the long, suffering patient at the counter. The patient apothecary was, in his long quiet way, a man of patient hope, and patient hope, by long inheritance, is one of the slow steady kindnesses that human beings have offered to one another, for as long as there have been human beings to do the offering. There is, perhaps, in this long quiet inheritance of the slow patient apothecary, something that the modern reader can take small comfort in. The long human story has not always been a story of certainty. It has often been a story of patient hope, of slow careful observation, of gentle small kindnesses offered across the long counter to the long, suffering patient who came to it. The slow patient apothecary at the counter, in our shop on the Vicus Sandalarius, in the late 2nd century of the Roman Empire, was one of countless quiet figures of the long human story who have offered, by patient daily inheritance, the small careful kindness of the cupboard to the long body and the long heart of those who came to them with their long troubles. There is, in this long quiet inheritance, a small steady warmth that has come down to us through the slow centuries. The patient apothecary at the long counter, who has now finished with the magical recipes of the cupboard, looks slowly up at the small lamp on the back counter, looks slowly across at the long shelves of the alabaster jars and the dark green glass flasks and the small linen bags, looks slowly out of the narrow doorway where the careful Roman city has settled, in its long way, into the quiet of the careful Roman night. The night is far advanced. The lamps burn steadily. The frankincense in the small bronze brazier on the floor sends up its slow thin curl of pale grey smoke. There is no hurry at all. It is time, the patient apothecary at the counter says, slowly, very quietly, to bring the long evening's work to a close. Let us turn, then, to the old closing of the long shop. The patient apothecary, in the long way of the steady Roman tradition, begins the small careful evening rituals of the closing of the shop. He takes down the small bronze pestle from the long bench, wipes it slowly with a clean linen cloth, and lays it carefully back into the careful heavy bronze mortar. He takes down the small bronze stirrer, wipes it slowly with a clean linen cloth, and lays it carefully back into the small clay pot on the patient bench. He takes down the small bronze scale pan, wipes it slowly with a clean linen cloth, and lays it carefully back into the gentle wooden box at the careful end of the old bench. He takes down the small bronze spatulas, the small bronze tweezers, the small bronze pipettes of the quiet eye preparations, and wipes each one slowly, carefully, in the patient turn of the patient evening hour, and lays each one carefully back into its careful place. He turns now to the quiet shelves of the careful alabaster jars. He inspects each quiet jar in the patient turn, runs his careful fingers gently along the gentle wax, sealed lids, listens for the small sound of the careful sealed wax, looks for the small sign of any long crack, any careful leak, any small failing of the slow preservation of the preparations. The careful jars all stand quietly, well sealed, well preserved, ready for the quiet next day's customers. The patient apothecary nods slowly to himself and turns now to the steady shelves of the careful dark green glass flasks. He inspects each gentle flask in the patient turn, holds each one up to the small lamp, looks for the small sign of any careful sediment, any gentle change of color, any small failing of the gentle preservation. The careful flasks all stand quietly, well stoppered, ready for the long next day's customers. The patient apothecary nods slowly and turns now to the long shelves of the quiet linen bags. He runs his quiet fingers gently across the small linen bags of the quiet dried herbs, smells the quiet familiar small scents of the quiet many herbs, the quiet chamomile and the quiet lavender, and the quiet thyme and the quiet rosemary, the quiet fennel and the quiet cumin and the quiet coriander, the quiet valerian and the quiet mandrake, and the quiet henbane. The quiet familiar small scents fill the patient nose by the long inheritance of the long working life. The patient apothecary smiles a small smile and nods slowly to himself. He turns now to the small bronze brazier on the floor. The careful frankincense has burned down to a small slow ember. He takes down a small clay tongs from the long bench, lifts the small ember with the patient tongs, drops it carefully into a small clay bucket of cool sand at the careful side of the quiet brazier, and watches the small ember slowly cool. The quiet slow thin curl of quiet pale grey smoke that has filled the quiet shop through the long evening slowly thins, slowly fades, slowly disappears into the slow of the quiet Roman night. He turns now to the small lamp on the careful back counter. The small flame burns quiet, steadily on the small floating wick. He takes down a small clay snuffer from the long bench, lowers it carefully over the small flame, holds it there for a small moment, and lifts it slowly. The small flame is gone. The quiet shop falls into the long shadow of the quiet Roman evening. He turns now to the small lamp at the patient threshold. The small flame burns steadily on the small floating wick. He takes down the small clay snuffer once more, lowers it carefully over the small flame, holds it there for a small moment, and lifts it slowly. The small flame is gone. The quiet shop falls into the quiet full, slow long shadow of the quiet Roman night. He turns now to the long doors of the quiet shop. He pulls them slowly closed, one by one, and slides the long wooden bar across them. By way of the slow protection of the long shop through the slow long Roman night, he turns the long key in the long lock, slides the long key into the small leather pouch at his quiet belt, and pats it slowly, by way of the slow checking that the long key is safely with him. He turns now to the quiet street. The quiet Vicus Sandalarius has fallen, in its long way, into the long of the quiet Roman night. The small olive oil lamps of the long booksellers have all been put out. The small olive oil lamps of the long sandal makers have all been put out. The small olive oil lamps of the long apothecaries have, by the slow turn of the quiet evening, all been put out. The quiet long stone arcade of the long shops stands quietly under the slow shadow of the quiet Roman night. The patient apothecary stands for a small moment at the patient doorway of the old shop, looks slowly up at the quiet stars, looks slowly down at the slow stones of the long street, and breathes in slowly the slow long Roman night. The quiet Roman air carries the long scents of the long shops, of the quiet warm bread of the long bakeries, of the quiet warm wine of the long taverns, of the quiet warm honey of the long beekeepers, all settling slowly together into the slow of the quiet Roman night. The patient apothecary turns slowly, walks slowly down the steady stone arcade, turns slowly into the gentle narrow side street that leads to his quiet home, walks slowly through the quiet streets of the quiet Roman capital, climbs slowly the old flight of stone stairs to his quiet apartment in the slow upper levels of the quiet insulae, lets himself slowly into the quiet rooms, lights a small lamp on the gentle table, and sits slowly down for the long evening meal of clean bread and clean wine and clean cheese and clean olives and clean dried figs that the patient wife has left quiet waiting for him on the old table. The careful Roman city, all around him, has settled in its long way into the long of the quiet Roman night. The quiet long shops are all closed. The quiet long taverns are all closed. The quiet long temples are all closed, save for the quiet Great Mother, temple of the quiet God, Asclepius on the small island in the slow middle of the quiet Tiber, where a small lamp burns quiet slowly through the long Roman night, by way of the long kindness of the gentle healer, God to the long sick of the quiet empire, who lie sleeping in the long porticos around him, dreaming of the gentle God, waiting in the long way of the long centuries, for the gentle God to come slowly to them, in the quiet of the quiet Roman night, and tell them, by way of the quiet kindness of the long centuries, what to do. And you, listener, who have walked with us slowly through this quiet evening of the quiet Roman apothecary's cupboard, may now, by slow inheritance, let your shoulders fall slowly, let your breath fall slowly, let the steady thoughts of the gentle day fall slowly, let your slow patient eyes fall slowly closed. The small lamp burns gentle slowly on the long table. The small frankincense in the small bronze brazier sends up its gentle thin curl of steady pale grey smoke. The quiet Roman city outside the quiet narrow doorway has settled into the quiet of the quiet Roman night. There is no hurry at all. There is nothing here that asks anything of you. The night is long, and the patient Roman shop is closed, and the old Roman streets are quiet, and the quiet Roman lamps have all been put out, and the long mother, temple of the quiet god Asclepius burns its small lamp on the small island in the quiet middle of the quiet Tiber, by way of the long kindness of the gentle God to the long sleeping sick. Sleep slowly, sleep softly, sleep gently. The quiet Roman night is long, and the quiet Roman quiet is long, and the quiet kindness of the long centuries reaches forward to you, very quietly, very gently, across the quiet 2,000 years, and lays its long hand upon your quiet, slow, long sleeping shoulder, and tells you very quietly that there is nothing tonight that asks anything of you, and that you may now, in the slow way of the long centuries, let yourself fall slowly, gently, quietly, into the slow sleep of the quiet Roman night. Good night, traveler, from the quiet shop of the quiet apothecary. Sleep well, sleep softly, sleep sleep gently. The quiet long Roman night, and the long Roman quiet, and the slow kindness of the long centuries will hold you slowly, very gently, very kindly, until the slow morning.